All right. All right, guys. It's going to be hopefully a fun class today. We're going to do some shoulder scapula stuff and really neat things that I'm going to try to teach you. I will apologize right off the bat. I'm a little jet lag. I emceed and called an auction last night for our UL basketball team, and it takes a lot of them. I think we raised over $200,000 program. I know it's not my money. So I'm not judged. And so, but it was a fun night. But so I'm a little late. But once I get going, I'll get my second in. Okay. All right. First things first, Thomas. Let's do it, man. Let's demonstrate shoulder scatter stuff. So as Thomas comes up to help me out, I just want to remind everybody that our scapula on the skeletons are like bolted in, like they're not allowed to move. So like we can move the shoulder, but the scapula on this skeleton isn't allowed to move. So sometimes that gets in the way of us seeing this rhythm of scapula and shoulder, how they're helping each other out, okay? But the demonstration we're going to do with Thomas really happened. So come over here, Thomas, if you don't mind. This really happened at a conference that I was at. I was in grad school, and this guy was selling do you remember? Maybe you don't remember because y'all weren't born in the 1900s. Or were you? Do y'all remember those holograms people were selling? Yeah, the little balance bracelets. They were selling these little balance bracelets. Of course, your intuition is like, that's crazy. But they would do these tricks to make you be like, right? They call them snake oil salesmen back in the day. So one of the guys at these conventions was doing this balance bracelet trick on me. And my buddies, my partners were over there. And he stood like this. And he said, okay, let's check your range of motion. He was like, oh man, look at that. Look at how bad your range of motion. You should be able to get your hand up over your head. And I'm playing along. I'm like, that's about, I don't know, you know? It's like, am I a fiddle of crap? Is this like my other claw? What? I'm playing along. And so he gives me the little power bracelet thing. He says, put that in your pocket and it's gonna, re-energize your body and you're gonna become one with the force and all this stuff. You just sail across it. So all of a sudden he comes here and then he does this. And all my buddies were just like, oh, they were like, oh, all right, they didn't know what to do. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Can I ask you a couple questions? And so one of the things I'm trying to teach you guys by working on your toolkit of applicable knowledge, we don't want to assume, we don't necessarily want to memorize everything because that leads us to be taken advantage of when they know the tricks and we can't figure out the tricks, okay? So what was happening is, we're going to do this example. I'm not going to push on Thomas's shoulder, like his arm. I'm going to push on his scapula, okay? Just his scapula. So in other words, I'm not influencing shoulder motion at all, okay? I'm going to just push down on your scapula. And what I'd like for you to do is see how high you can raise your shoulder without your scapula help. That's crazy, huh? Now watch, keep going up. It's a big difference, okay? In addition, Thomas's shoulder, when he's internally, one of the reasons the snake oil hologram dude was standing here is he didn't want people to see that he was internally rotating the shoulder. What happens when you internally rotate your shoulder is, so let's say Ken is normally facing here. When you internally rotate, Ken's here. And when we go to abduct, we run out of articulating surface at the socket very early. Remember, we have to have smooth on smooth, right? We have to have hyaline on hyaline. So the lesson for today is how our shoulders, to get a little bit of extra abduction, has to externally rotate so that we can go up a little bit further and keep smooth on smooth. Does that make sense? Okay. Thanks. Give Thomas a round of applause. I hope I wasn't pulling too hard. I'm pretty pretty beefy, you know. All right, joke. So today's lesson is our scapula contributes a big significant part to our function, reaching forward, reaching back, reaching up. And shoulder motion alone, the glenohumeral joint, is a big part of that. But it's a part that I think comes more natural to us than the scapular contribution, if that makes sense. Okay. So again, if this was a pie chart and I was able to get my hand above my head at 180 degrees globally, you know, 60% of that pie chart is scapular contribution. So it may not be the most, but it's a big chunk. I mean, we're not talking like you know, small little insignificant contributions here. Okay. So remember, we look at motion relative locally to the joints, not globally. Okay, not globally. So what I'd like for you to do right now is we're going to try that little experiment on yourself. So what I'd like you to do is take, if you have a shoulder that's hurt, obviously don't do that, but really cautiously try to keep your scapula depressed and take one arm and just kind of, so that you know not to cheat. Try to keep your scapula depressed and then try to abduct as high as you can. And I want you to notice how like your scapula is going to want to start riding up, right? That's a big deal. And then take it off and then see how high you go with that contribution. So this little experiment helps us to, in my opinion, appreciate, because when we hold it down, we're trying to say, hey, scapula, I don't want you to help. I just want to see what my shoulder can do on its own. And then we say, okay, scapula, now help me out. Does that make sense? And we don't really give that scapula that credit because our eyes want to see here and we want to see here. It's hard to see what's happening in here. Okay. So scapular contribution to shoulder. Let's go back into that external rotation of the shoulder, and then I'm going to re-emphasize what you're going to have to know for the test and what you're not going to have to know for the test. Okay. So here is Ken, the real MVP of class, right? I use Ken for all kinds of demonstrations. So Ken's head is literally represents our head of the humerus. It's a pretty decent analogy. And his face is going to be the smooth part of the head of the humerus. But notice the head of the humerus isn't all smooth. It's not like a full golf ball. It's like half of a golf ball. And then the other half is condyles and tubercles and places that muscles are yanking on, tugging on. So there's only one side that's smooth. So when you have flexion only, notice smooth stays on smooth naturally. Does that make sense? So when I do something like this, and I'm not talking about the scapula, literally just the glenohumeral joint. When I have flexion, smooth stays on smooth. But if I go lateral flexion or abduction, I can't just keep doing this. Does that make sense? That can't happen. We can't have the back part of the humerus articulate with the socket. So what happens is you only get so much before you run out of real estate, before you can't go any further. And the scapula can help me get up a little higher. But if I don't let the scapula do it, you only have so much abduction you can do before you run out of real estate. So this is what your body does. Your body will externally rotate. In essence, it's repositioning the head so that you can keep going up and have smooth on smooth. And think about it. You get to the same place. A to B, flexion, gets you to the same place as abduction and external rotation. Does that make sense? It gets you to the same place. Here's a big illusion. Here's a big illusion, but I'm hoping by now we're starting to see the patterns of these pesky illusions, okay? When we're down here, anatomical position, externally rotated, laterally rotated. My biceps, which is a good indicator of my humerus, is going to be facing laterally or out. Okay. When I'm internally rotated down here, my biceps are going to be facing medially. Or again, we talked about that. Hey, right arm, spin laterally, spin medially. Because we can't say right spin right, because that'd be the same motion as left spin left, right? Talked about that. So check this out. When I go up here, when I go up here, the biceps look like they're facing in. Thomas already sees where I'm going. That's awesome. When I'm up here, my biceps are facing in, right? So your mind is like, oh, facing in up here must be the same as facing in down here. And it's not. And I'll show you how. I always prove or I always try to reinforce what I tell you. I try not to be the hologram salesman. If you're willing and you're able, let's put our hands up over our head. And now what I'd like for us to do is slowly adduct. Do not rotate, just slowly adduct. And you tell me, are your biceps facing laterally or medially? Are they facing out or in? Out. Facing out. So that shows you have to be externally rotated when you're up here. Make sense? Ken, let's use Ken. Ken is here. Yes, his face is facing in. But if he were to adduct, he would be externally rotated. Make sense? So on the test, it's going to be one of those illusions where I might ask, what's my position of my shoulders? And I'm going to be very clear if I'm asking about add, flex, because remember, I can get to the same place. That's why some people call it lateral flexion, because you can get to the same place if you have abduction and external rotation. But I'm going to say, like, what's my position in the sagittal plane? Well, you know I'm flexed or extended. What's my position frontal? Ab or add. And then I may specifically ask, how is my shoulder rotated up here? It has to be externally rotated. It has to be. How many of you have ever done, I'm assuming yes, but I shouldn't assume. That's our first rule of this class, okay? Have you ever done upright rows? What I want you to notice is if you do them slow enough, when you start to get up higher, notice how my shoulder starts to do this. It's external rotation. And you got to get those elbows high. You got to get those elbows high. You see that? From here, my bicep, when I come up, my bicep is facing down. But when I get to the top, my bicep is facing up. And the only way that could have happened is if I had external rotation. So sometimes these motions are hidden because we got a lot of things going on and there's a lot of distractions. But for the purposes of this class, I just want you guys to know that if I'm ultimately going to get to the same place, sagittally or frontally, my shoulder has to do another step when it goes frontal. It has to do this and this in order to get to the same place as this. Abduction and external rotation is going to get me ultimately to the same place as flexion. Okay? All right. Let me go into a little bit more detail of the shoulder girdle. So our shoulder girdle, I think I mentioned it last class, but I just want to make sure. Our upper extremities version of the pelvis, The pelvis has multiple little joints in there that connects it. Here we have multiple joints. The sternoclavicular, the acromioclavicular, and all the acromion is an area of the scapula. So the scapula is one bone, your shoulder blade. And it's like, if anybody's ever heard of the Panhandle of Florida, it's still part of Florida, but it's a certain area. Right? Acadiana is a certain area of Louisiana. So when you hear acromion, that's not a separate bone. That's just like the panhandle of the scapula. So where the collarbone attaches to the scapula, right here. When I was in high school, I had a sprain. I was so dumb. I removed all the inside padding of my shoulder pads because I was a receiver and I wanted to have more motion. So I only had like one little flappy shell of that. And a guy who ends up being a buddy of mine in college puts his helmet right into my shoulder. And I. So the next day I go to the clinic and the doctor said, you have a sprained shoulder. And later on in college, I realized, well, he didn't mean like my shoulder joint. He meant part of my shoulder girdle, and that was my acromion clavicular joint, my AC joint. Okay. So sometimes that gets tricky. Shoulder girdle, shoulder. When we say shoulder, we're talking about specifically the glenohumeral joint, the ball and socket, add, flexion, extension, external, internal rotation. When we talk about our shoulder girdle, our scapula, that's actually why we use the word scapula, because shoulder girdle is all the things. So when we say shoulder, that's glenohumeral, that's ball and socket. Our movement options are flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal, external, and then we have that variation of ab and ad that we call horizontal ab and ad, okay? For our scapula, we say scapula because it help again. It's just how I say it's just, but for our shoulder blade, this flat shoulder blade, we have a lot of, you can see all these different red and blue marks. That's musculature. We have a ton of muscles that are yanking on that scapula. And as we lift the scapula up, everything attached to it is going to go up. Right? It's almost kind of like if I yank the arm down, everything attached to it. So that's why we refer to it as scapular movement, because most of the muscles that are influencing this whole girdle are yanking on this big flat bone back here. Okay? So our scapular contributions, elevation, depression, helps me get up a little high or a little low. Protraction and retraction helps me get a little bit more forward, a little bit more back. And then upward and downward rotation helps my clock hand get up a little closer to 12 and come back down from 12. It's not even tricky, but up and down, I think I tried to explain it last class, but I want to do it again because it is a little weird. The upward and downward rotation helps get me to 12 o'clock globally. If you guys remember, like my shoulder joint will get me about 120 degrees when it abducts or externally rotates or flexes. And then my whole clock or the scapula will help rotate about 60 to help get my hand up over my head. Okay? Elevation and depression is like helping me get it literally a little higher up and down. You see the difference? So sometimes like up can kind of mean like up as I rotate, I can get my hand higher and higher and higher. But that's different than elevation and depression. That can literally help get me a little bit higher. Okay. Because there's kind of some nuance, I think I mentioned it last class, my questions are going to be very, very clear. What I'm asking you about upward and downward rotation, it's going to coincide with shoulder motion that's helping get our hands up to 12 o'clock, like flexions and extensions or abductions and adductions. Like, how would the scapula work with the shoulder when we're doing shoulder press? Like I might have that exercise, right? And you'd be like, okay, well, as I abduct, my scapula is going to upwardly rotate. That makes sense? I'm gonna link those two things together. I don't have to move my shoulder when I'm protracting and retracting. Like I can have my shoulder in a flexed position and protract or retract. So those kind of functional questions of the, you can shrug and elevate and depress, your arms don't have to go up, okay? There is some, I'm probably going to get into it Friday. There are some simultaneous movements that happen in elevation and depression, but that's only to help keep your arm parallel with gravity. What I mean by that is if I didn't move my shoulder while I shrug, my arms would go out to the side. So there is a little compensation, almost kind of like how your hip adducts when when you move your pelvic girdle, okay? Another thing on the test that students miss, at no fault of your own, what do we call this exercise? I go to the weight rack and I grab, what you think? Something realistic? 200 pounds? All right, 15 pounds. What is this exercise called? And guys, I don't judge. We live in a world where people don't know any better. They practice fitness, they practice exercise, as they should. But we need to know, what's this exercise called? Okay, what usually comes before shrug? Shoulder shrug. If this was a shoulder shrug, so think about it, shoulder, glenohumeral joint, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation. If this was truly a shoulder shrug, this is what would have to happen. Humerus, socket. All right, shoulder, shrug. You got it, dude. Dislocate. What's really moving when we do shrugs? And again, I know that sounds nitpicky, but it's important. It's like when we were talking about ankle and subtalar, right? You sprain your ankle. A high ankle sprain is an ankle sprain. Nothing high about it. A low ankle sprain is not an ankle. It's a subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. That was if you guys remember the skateboard analogy where the ankle's the wheels and the subtalar is the wobble, right? If you want to mess with your friends, next time you do shrugs, calling them shoulder is arbitrary. The shoulder joint is just going along for the ride because it's attached to the scapula. But you could call them elbow shrugs. They're going up and down. Or my favorite, wrist shrug. Hey man, you mind getting, I need to get a set of wrist shrugs. I mean, they're shrugging, right? Phalangeal shrugs is another favorite of mine if you really want to weird them out. Think about it. Everything attached is just going along for the ride. So just to say the shoulder is just as arbitrarily incorrect as saying the elbow shrugging or the wrist shrugging or the finger shrugging. Okay? So I'm telling you guys, I'm going to ask this type of question on the test. That includes you guys that are watching later on. I'm going to ask you a question about shrugs. And the answer choices are going to be shoulder elevation, shoulder depression, scapula elevation, scapula depression. You see what I'm getting at? And it makes sense why so many, and sometimes it's not even your fault. The answer choices are mixed, they're at random. So that first choice might be shoulder elevation or shoulder depression. Got him. But that's how brainwashed we are to that type of verbiage. And again, I'm not saying we got to start a campaign and picket on the corner of Johnston and St. Mary saying we need to stop calling them shoulder shrugs. But we need to know that. We need to know that. Okay? So the shoulder doesn't elevate or depress. So if something's elevating and depressing, we need to give anesthesia what it is. Just call it like it is. Okay? Not call it like we see it, because we can't rely on our eyes a lot of times. We have to call it what it is, right? So scapula elevation, scapula depression. Let's look at a couple of different exercises and try to apply some of this scapula shoulder. Let me teach you. Next time you guys are working out or exercising, or even if you don't, try this at home or in the gym. And I would like for you to separate the scapula from the shoulder when you're doing these movements. Because to me, that's a great way to practice. So if somebody was on a bench, and let's say they were doing a bent over row, make sure I can see it. Don't judge my form. I'm old. Yeah. So this is what I want you to do. If you were on a bench and you were horizontal, you have a dumbbell, instead of doing this movement all at once, what I'd love for you to do is retract your scapula first and then do shoulder extension. Not only will it help you to see the contribution, like that's a big contribution. Guys, this was just all scapula. Not only that, but you get to use inertia twice. So you kind of stop the momentum with your scapular muscles, and then all of that extra motion at your shoulder would just be your shoulder muscle. Does that make sense? It's kind of like moving furniture. The hardest thing to do is get the furniture going, but it's not as hard to keep it going. So if I get the furniture going with all those big, powerful muscles in my scapula, it's easier to keep the furniture moving than to stop and then start the motion again with those shoulder muscles. So in terms of like isolation of those shoulder muscles, that's great. But for me, it's practicing motion, seeing the contribution of your scapula to help you reach a little bit forward, help you reach a little bit further back. Okay. So if we were doing like a, on the test, if I asked you like a seated row kind of question, so like maybe you're here and you do something like this, right? I'm going to word it in a way where it would be like, how could the scapula contribute to the shoulder pulling the bar closer to your chest, let's say? So if you think about that question, that has nothing to do with upward and downward rotation, because upward and downward rotation is about getting my clock hand to 12, right? That's where those key words, the retraction is really going to help me get it closer to my chest. Does that make sense? If all I did was move my shoulders, scapula. Or if all I did was move my shoulders, because that extra motion that the scapula gives me when my arm is straight, it's huge. And I'm tight as a snare drum. Your scapula probably contributes even more. Okay. So I always like to emphasize my students, when they leave 310, are going to have a much better understanding of pelvic girdle, trunk, hip, shoulder, scapula, because all of these parts are kind of working together for these functional tasks. And that's great, but that's part of the trouble of seeing those independent components, because they do a lot of times work together. Like, think of it like this. You know, I always use, or I've used the Etch-a-Sketch analogy in the past, right? You got an up-down lock knob, you got a left-right knob. Imagine if you didn't see those knobs, like they were covered, I don't know, with clothing, and all you saw was loop-de-loops on the Etch-a-Sketch. It would be hard to know that that combinational motion is actually the combination of two simple knobs, two separate simple knobs. And so a lot of our motion is very similar. We get all these complex Etch-a-Sketch loop-de-loops, but in reality, all it's made up of is simple movements of independent individual knobs on our Etch-a-Sketch. And I'm trying to teach you what each knob does, how each knob works, and being able to say, oh, yeah, the loop-de-loop is happening, but that loop-de-loop is actually made of these combinational motions happening in a certain sequence. So like, I'll get this question sometimes about like motion of the shoulder that would be like this. So has anybody ever heard the word circumduction? Circumduction. Circumduction is not a specific motion. It's a movement pattern. Circumduction is making circles on the Etch-a-Sketch because you keep moving the same knobs in a certain way. So in other words, if I was looking at my shoulder, I would be like flexion, horizontal ab, extend. Now, of course, again, combinations, because we don't live in robot world. So I'm just using this as a general example. Flexion, horizontal ab, extension, adduction, horizontal add, flexion. So once you, and so imagine the square, and then all of a sudden we start rounding off those corners. So in other words, what I just did is I did a block in my car. I went north, I went east, I went south, I went west. And then gradually I turned that square into a track. And I'm just going around the track. It's the same concept. Okay, same concept. Did I do the little trick with you guys? I think this is a good one to show movement patterns. Maybe I did it with our hands, I can't remember. So one cool little way to show movement pattern is with a cup. And you do this. Did we do this movement pattern in class? Yes. Where you can, so for someone that, again, that doesn't know, they're like, well, wow, you just have a continuous, like taking a bicycle wheel and just spinning it, and it could just in perpetuity, whatever that fancy word is, perpetual motion, right? Look, English is not my thing, okay? Hashtag Delta. But you can keep going. Now we can talk about how that happens. It's really cool. So when I'm here, I'm going to have internal rotation my shoulder. Okay. What's coming next, we're going to do elbow and radial ulnar joint. I'm going to pronate my radial ulnar joint. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise my shoulder by externally rotating and supinating my radial ulnar joint to basically get me back to the same starting position. Internally rotate and pronate, externally rotate and supinate. Internally rotate and pronate, externally rotate and supinate. So when you do that sequence over and over, it looks like it just keeps spinning, like the wheel keeps spinning. But you can't. We can't keep spinning our wheel. We can move it a little bit, then we have to reset it so that we can move again. Does that make sense? If you're able to move any joint repeatedly, you are possessed. It's Halloween. No, I don't mean any disrespect for those of you that are possessed. Any questions so far? Clarifications? Shoulder scapula? No, come on.
But extension of the shoulder into fetal and out of fetal between like the shoulder, because this isn't, I guess it's out.
That's flexion.
But it's out of fetal.
No, it's more in the fetal. But my job is to show you why. So the question is the shoulder, and this is not you. This is very weird.
Yeah.
So it's not you. Every semester, this is really weird. So if one of the ways I try to teach it in the if I was going to ask you to get into a ball, right? Like, because fetal position is literally trying to get into a ball, right? Trying to get all of your mass as tightly packed as you can. Or you think about it like if you were trying to protect yourself, like heads up, right? Okay. What you would not do is heads up, look out. You would do this. And if I brought everything back to anatomical except my shoulders, this is where I would be. Does that make sense? Another way to look at it. So again, it's not you. ESPN has been lying to you your whole life. When they say full extension, the only thing fully extended is your elbow, and you were like that when you were just standing in the outfield. Here's another way to look at it. The shoulder follows the same rules as the hip. Ab, 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 ab. Add, 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 add. External, internal. Why wouldn't this both be flexion?
So that makes this extension.
Yes, absolutely. You're further away from getting into it. This is the worst possible thing for me to get into a ball. It, it's weird, but I'm hoping that those examples kind of help to retrain our brains to not think of full extension. Like, because again, it practically it makes sense. I'm reaching out for something, I'm extending for it. But what happens is that your elbow is extended. Maybe your fingers are extended, but we analyze motion joint by joint. Your shoulder is flexed. And I'm glad you asked that question because I guarantee you there's other students that are still not quite sure or confident about the shoulder flexion and the shoulder extension. So remember, fetal is a good way to remember it. And then also following the same rules as the hip. So if this is hip flexion, this would also be shoulder flexion. Extension, extension, add, external, internal. Not a dumb question. Very important question. And I don't know what I don't know. So unless I get some of those kind of questions or clarifications, I can't do my job. So I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
Is it safe to say whenever something's flexing, you can only tell by the tightness of it? How it's tight?
What a great question. You can't. And let me tell you why. So true, when you're flexing something, you'll feel tightness on another end. But if you're extending something, you'll feel tightness on the other end, right? Because you have muscles that pull in every direction of motion. So because you have muscles that pull in every direction of motion, any motion you have, a certain muscle group that pulls the other way is going to be tight. So in other words, if I flex my wrist, I feel tightness on my extensors. But if I extend my wrist, I feel tightness on my flexors. Does that make sense? So although your statement is true, if I flex, I feel tightness somewhere, it's not always true because I can feel tightness when I extend. And that's a function of muscles and how they pull. So any motion that you take, you can feel tightness from the muscles that pull the other way. Great question. Great question. Did I answer it? Awesome. Anything else? Y'all, we could talk about anything y'all want. We could talk about current events. I just have one rule. There are no rules. Yeah.
I'll give that. But so I have a wing shoulder blade, swimmers all what you call it. And
I'm not celebrating your palsy. I just am fascinated with scapular weighting.
and the reason that I can't rely on this left shoulder for regular like scapular motion.
You want me to answer why?
What?
You want me to answer why?
Why?
So this isn't going to be on your test, but it will be in biomechanics. So one of the major muscles that you have at your scapula is called the serratus anterior. Serratus, you think of a serrated blade. These are the little finger-like projections that you see like on the ribs. But the cool thing is they go in between your ribs and your scapula like deli meat in between two loaves of bread. And their role is to pull the scapula in a direction of protraction. I'm assuming your dominant arm is right, you're right-handed.
I write with my left.
But in terms of like doing stuff.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, because I write with my right, but I throw with my left. So my serratus anterior, my scapular muscle is more dominant on my throwing, okay? So your non-dominant arm, that serratus anterior, that's a protraction puller, doesn't get innervated as much. It doesn't get recruited as much. And so what happens is that serratus anterior, your scapula is literally floating. It's floating. It's not attached with a synovium and a capsule and all these.
It's literally just floating here. And so when that muscle, because of a palsy, because it's not getting nerve innervated, but you can help improve that by innervating it and helping to draw that scapula more flush against your thorax. So it's a serratus anterior problem. And so when you have the winging scapula, that's the people that do the cool party trick where they can fit their hand in between their scapula. So that's a serratus anterior problem. Usually the non-dominant arm, that serratus anterior is not as innervated as much as your dominant arm doing things.
And I was a swimmer for like 12, 14 years.
Outstanding.
And they said it was like nerve damage from actually overuse.
Very fascinating. Did you do all the strokes or did you have a specialty?
My specialty was freestyle.
You're a freestyle. Awesome. But like even freestylers, now they're taught to kind of, it's not all symmetric. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I used to work with the swim team at Auburn, where you kind of have a dominant side. Like, so even that little nuance of preference can sometimes weigh into it. But that's the sort. Did they give you any things to do, like to try to like protraction exercises?
It's mostly all, but they did do some of this protraction.
Awesome, awesome. Another cool thing. What I'm trying to hype up biomechanics because we talk a lot about these issues. What's really cool is for the scapular motion, it's like we call it a force couple, where if you were if you were outside for PE with kids and they were on the merry-go-round, they love you more when you have someone else on the other side of the merry-go-round and they're pushing one way and you're pushing the other way, but y'all are both pushing the same rotational way. Okay, we call that a force couple. Your scapula has muscles that serve as a force couple. So in other words, let's say here's my scapula and I have upward rotation pullers. But what would be more efficient is if I had some muscles pulling up here and some muscles pulling down there and work together to spin it, right? So your non-dominant arm serratus anterior works with your trap to do that concept. So since your serratus anterior has palsy and it can't contribute as much, your non-dominant trap is usually more developed. You're usually tight on that non-dominant because it's compensating, because it's doing more, because that serratus anterior, it's taking up some of that slack. So one of my little snake oil tricks is I can see arm dominance based off of trap level. It's kind of an illusion. Most people are right-handed, but every now and then I'll pick out a lefty because I could tell their shoulder level, and I'll be like, "You left-handed? How did you do that?" Stalker. It's kind of. The last thing I'll leave you with is to show you the potential of the scapular contribution. Has anybody ever seen, there's a tribe, I forgot if it's India or Africa, but they're a tribe and one of their customs is to wear those the rings around their neck. Have you ever seen them? So it's the last thing I'm going to show you, and it's just because it's fascinating and neat. And I'm hoping that it'll help us see the amazing contributions of the scapula. If anything, I want you guys today to have an appreciation of our scapula. Our scapula is kind of like, it doesn't get enough credit. Like shoulder gets all the love, right? But the scapula is really, really important to function. Okay, so let's see. Let's go keywords and hope that Google doesn't put anything crazy. Okay, that might be Photoshop. I mean, I'm not one for context clues, but check this out, you guys. Did y'all know that a giraffe, long-necked giraffe, has the same number of vertebrae as we do? They're just long vertebrae. So the people in this tribe, they don't have longer necks. Like they haven't evolved to a new species. Their scapula has been depressed over time with muscles atrophying up. That goes to show you how much scapular motion we have. So in other words, those people that have those rings around their necks for a long time, they can't take them off because they have no muscle. So that's to show you, like, if we were to atrophy all the muscles of our neck, we could compress the scapula further, 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 further. That's really cool. All right, yeah. See you next time. Good feedback today, guys. Keep those questions, comments, curiosities coming.